Welcome to this breakout panel titled Changing Landscape of EDemocracy. We'll be discussing how social media has influenced the subject of EDemocracy, and we have our distinguished panel, Carol Soon, we have Astik Sinha and Marco Skoric, and they're all going to bring their detailed insights and research to this topic. Earlier this morning we heard a broader introduction, if you like, about the role of EDemocracy. That did come into the discussions, but I'm very much looking forward to hearing the individual insights that we have today. So EDemocracy is a tool that's been used by governments actively all over the world since the late 1990s to approach citizens. It enables immediate communication with voters. The impact, reach and methods of EDemocracy have changed since the mid-2000s, when governments as well as officials started using social media tools to present and advertise their policies. So as I mentioned, the opening plenary introduced broadly some of these concepts, but we have a panel now that brings us more detailed insights from Hong Kong to Singapore to India. We have a mixture of research and studies from the region, as well as first-hand accounts and examples of how EDemocracy works today. What lessons can we learn and what it might look like in the future? So please join me with welcoming our panel first this afternoon. First, I'm going to call on Dr. Carol Soon to open with some comments about her insights. Now, Dr. Carol Soon is a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore. Her research interests include digital engagement, digital inclusion, surveillance, deliberative practices, and Singapore as a digital village. Carol led the study of media and internet use during the 2015 general election, and Carol has taught several courses at the National University of Singapore in advanced communications and media research. She's currently teaching a module on public policy, public opinion and new media at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Carol's also worked in the corporate sector, where she developed communication campaigns for profit and non-profit organisations prior to joining NUS. So please, welcome to the stage, Dr. Carol Soon.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the post-lunch session. So stay with us till tea. Now, I think the theme is Changing Landscape of EDemocracy. So I thought it's quite apt to maybe open with this slide on the question of open net and open society. Now, some of you may be familiar with a book that was published by Calateo and Boas quite many years ago when the internet first became popular and widespread, with many people adopting very positive and almost utopian perspectives about the internet and its impact. So I think Calateo and Boas's book provides many interesting and rich analysis of different regimes in different parts of the world, ranging from China to India, and they talked about how the impact of the internet really is, contextualized and nuanced by the different kinds of dynamics, population traits, etc., that's specific to each country. So then, of course, in 2005, I think it was, Terry Flew, who then published a book on Web 1.0 and Web 2.0, right? As most of us are quite familiar with, when Web 2.0 technologies specifically say user-generated content platforms and social media became more widespread, it further led to greater expectations of more democratization. That is because compared to, say, Web 1.0, people actually now require even lower thresholds for skill sets and even less outright investments to put up their own content. Think about your Web 1.0, you either have to know how to use HTML to code your own websites, or you jolly well have the resources to pay for experts who can design a snazzy website for you. But say come to Web 2.0, you look at your blogs, your Wikipedia, etc. You have basically ready-to-make platforms that you can easily personalize. So hence, there were lots of expectations about participation and further equalizing people's usage of technologies. So if we look at the case of Singapore, recent surveys by the Infocom Media Development Authority shows very high penetration rate, right? So almost all Singapore residents below the age of 35 are internet users. And if you look at the figures, the latest figures by We Are Social, published in 2017, 85% of Singaporeans are unique mobile users, and our internet penetration reached 82%. So in terms of policies, the government has pushed out quite a good slate of policies to enhance digital inclusion and penetration, ranging from the $15 million Digital Inclusion Fund that tries to connect, say, elderly citizens, as well as people from low-income families with gadgets and internet penetration. And of course, on the front of the users, many things were taking shape post-2000. So in the early 2000s, we saw the rise of very popular websites like Yawning Bread, and even satirical websites like Talking Cock. So this picture you see here, basically through social media, specifically blogs into the limelight, when the blogger Alex Au, a very prominent gay rights activist, published a picture of an opposition party's rally in 2006 during the general election. So this picture made its, rounds very rapidly on the internet because in the mainstream media, in the mainstream press, you generally didn't see such overwhelming pictures that show overwhelming support at opposition candidates' rallies. And the talk about democratization and promoting of participation is very evident in literature elsewhere. So just this morning alone at the first session, we heard speakers talking about the Arab Spring a couple of times. I mean, in Iran, a fair bit of work has been done that kind of showcase and demonstrate how mobile technologies and digital cameras are used by regular citizens to get their stories out. And oftentimes, these stories are also picked up by traditional media, which then, provides people with an alternative platform, okay, to get the word out. And when we talk about political participation or engagement, oftentimes there is a wide range of activities. So in my earlier work, we looked at by now a relatively outdated but still very relevant ladder of participation put forth by Milbrath, right? And if you look at Lee and Bernoff, who essentially looked at the role of groundswell, the role of the internet and digital technologies in providing the public to react, an avenue to react to public policies, etc. They talk about groundswell, and that was published in 2008. But what you can see in these two ladders or hierarchies is clearly there is a wide range of activities when it comes to civic engagement or political participation, be it in the offline context as illustrated by Milbrath's figure, or in the online context as illustrated by Lee and Bernoff. The point is, the internet has clearly opened a lot more opportunities and provided people with a wider array of activities that they can participate with, right? And different activities would require different thresholds of commitment and even comfort. So in Singapore, what I've done for this presentation is to do a multiple snapshot. So over the past 5 to 6 years, we have done several surveys, one in 2010, another one during the elections in 2011, a third one in 2015 during the elections as well. So these are some of the details of these various surveys. And what I've done for today's presentation really is to, try to piece together a picture of what has changed in the, last 5 to 6 years and what hasn't. Right? And what are the implications then for the so-called changing landscape of e-democracy? So if we look at the characteristics of the general public in Singapore, what we found is through these 3 snapshots, people are talking more and discussing more about politics, be it with their friends or family members, etc. So clearly, from 2010 to 2015, we see a relatively sharp increase in terms of people's interest and engagement in political discussions with people in their networks. Now, in terms of political traits, we were interested to find out how efficacious people were, right, when it comes to political issues. So we had questions that measured their internal efficacy and external efficacy. So if you look at internal efficacy, we asked them about their gauge of their understanding of political issues. And for external efficacy, we asked them in their belief. We questioned them about their belief in the power of collective action, right? And if you look at both findings between 2010 and 2015, and we're talking about representative samples here, generally Singaporeans became more efficacious, right? They have a better confidence of their understanding of political issues. They also have stronger belief that politicians or the government will respond to people's needs if people band together, hence collective power. So then I was curious to look at their usage of different types of media, and we largely categorize them into mainstream media and social media. So the next couple of charts will show you the patterns over the past 5 years with regards to their media consumption. So if you look at TV, television, and newspapers, the usage has increased over the past few years. And I think this was reflected in an earlier presentation in panel 2, where one of the speakers talked about how TV was and is the most used medium for information. So that is something that we found here in Singapore as well. And then we look at online websites of Singapore mainstream media, and you could see how basically the usage, as represented by the blue color, increased significantly. And the same applied to mainstream media usage for radio. Then let's take a look at, say, social media usage. You can see across, say, blogs, YouTube, whether it's reading or writing, there was an increase over the past couple of years. Same, when we ask them questions about writing or leaving a comment on other people's blog, Facebook, we saw an increase as well. But what was really significant was the use of Facebook as an information source for political and social issues. So usage is clearly there, okay, greater access as well. Now, instant messaging was something new. It was a question that we included in 2015 because prior to that, it was relatively unknown. So leading up to 2015, we saw many people using WhatsApp, which is very popular here in Singapore, to exchange information with one another. So the use of WhatsApp during the general election in 2015 was quite high. More than 60% used it to share information and political commentaries relating to the general election, and more than half actually started a discussion on their WhatsApp circles. We were interested to see how mainstream media and social media compared to how they fare when we compared them in terms of usage as well as trust. So we ranked them on both counts, and what we found was that during the election time, mainstream media was most used. And even though the difference is not that much bigger, when it came to trust, mainstream platforms such as TV stations, newspapers, and radio stations were more trusted than social media platforms. Okay, so that we thought was really quite interesting. So now, besides measuring usage, we wanted to know what people did on various social media platforms. And this was a scale that was developed with a colleague, and I think work that Marco is also very familiar with, where we ask people what they did on various social media platforms, ranging from blogs, YouTube, Facebook, to instant messaging. And in terms of usage, there were really a few types, from the most basic, such as information users, to activities that require a bit more commitment, more time, such as expressive users like creating content, to relational users where you use the social media to find out more about what other people are thinking and thinking about the election. So what we found was that participation was generally quite low, but participation was even lower for activities that required more effort and more time, such as making a video or creating content. Okay, so what was more common were just using it as an information source, following other people, other users, following a discussion thread. So then we wanted to see, okay, we have established a picture about people's efficacy, the fact that they have talked more over the past few years when it comes to political issues. Then we were interested to find out, in terms of offline participation, what was the engagement like? And you could see over the past few years, the figures didn't really change that much, right? And we're talking about participation in activities such as taking part in an event for a good cause, or joining or being a member in a welfare organization or a non-governmental organization. We also look at offline participation in terms of rally attendance during the 2 elections, and again, it was relatively similar. So in the last election, we asked people a question on what were the reasons that influenced how they voted. We gave them a series of 10 factors, and we asked them to indicate if each factor influenced how they cast their vote during the last election. And as you can see from this slide, the top 3 factors were basically factors that are related to governance, right? So for instance, the top factor that influenced how people voted was the quality of the parties or the representatives in their constituency, followed by Singapore's vulnerability as a country and policy changes that's related to transportation, etc. So a bit of a context here. In 2011, it's commonly known here, or even in Asia, that it was a watershed election for Singapore because the ruling party, PAP, actually lost group representative constituency, which has never happened before. So between 2011 to 2015, what we saw was the government's responsiveness in reacting or responding to people's grievances and unhappiness or dissatisfaction, especially pertaining to housing, employment, and or education. So these were some of the things that happened, and we weren't exactly surprised with this. So just some thoughts for discussion, right? I mean, based on what we've found, and this is the first time we're doing these snapshots across a few years, and we hope to pursue more of this research in the coming months. These are some things for food for thought. So political talk, increased political talk, and better or enhanced political efficacy do not necessarily lead to, say, more political participation, right? Generally, in Singapore, what we found is that the citizens are still very much spectators that are quite low on the social technographics ladder, right? What we saw earlier was that they do participate online, but it was infrequent and generally passive, okay? Mainstream media still dominate as a source of information. So what I think is important to think about when we want to consider how the landscape of e-democracy is changing is to remember the fact that social media does not exist in a vacuum, right? But it really is part of a larger and more complicated media ecology, and we have to think about how, say, other forms of media, particularly mainstream media, is evolving too. The other thing is, when we want to look at democratization, for instance, it is important not to look at just the numbers, but also what is it that people are doing online, what is it that they're not doing online, and also to consider the governance, the state of governance that really does play a very important part in shaping people's activities in the online space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some wonderful insights there. Thanks, Carol. That's great. Well, next I'll call on Dr. Marco Skoric, who is an Associate Professor at the Department of Media and Communication at City University of Hong Kong. Now, Marco's teaching and research interests are focused on new media and social change, with particular emphasis on civic and political implications of new communication technologies. Now, Marco is a member of the editorial boards of International Journal of Public Opinion Research and New Media and Society. He also chairs the International Conference for EDemocracy and Open Government Asia and New Media and Citizenship in Asia series of International Communication Association pre-conferences. So, Dr. Marco, please welcome Dr. Marco to the stage.
Thank you very much, and Carol, thank you very much again for doing such a great introduction, because I can save some time now on introducing similar topics. Today I'm going to talk about something that's very related to, I think, the theme of this conference, and one of the themes is, of course, the populism and polarization. And I'm going to do a brief introduction on what we thought social media is going to change about our lives, and how social media ecology actually has evolved into something a little bit different, I think, than what we expected. So let me see how this works. Like this. Like this. Okay. Oh, this is back. And how do you go? Oh, this way. Okay. Okay. So very basic introduction. If you look at the number of people connected via social media, it is really amazing. So we're reaching almost 3 billion people who are now connected. What is even more amazing about this number of 3 billion people is that they are mostly connected by 4 degrees of separation. So on average, if you jump 5 times, friend of a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend, you can reach probably anyone on Facebook. So in some ways, we are much more connected than ever before. In some ways, we share much more information than before, and there's definitely some potential in terms of, let's say, civic and political engagement. If you look at the number of users in Asia is also quite amazing, especially if you look at these different ecologies. WeChat is a separate ecology from Facebook completely. So you have 1.3 billion people cut off in China from Facebook, so they have their own sort of different ecology. And again, they are also very much connected. What is more interesting, I think, about the Web 2.0, as Carol mentioned, is that the networks that were there before, let's say in the late 90s, there were networks that were focused mostly on interests. So there were communities of interest, people who are, let's say, stamp collectors, or people who are interested in politics, or people who are interested in some kind of activism. That has changed a little bit, because now most of the networks that we use to communicate with each other are what we call egocentric networks. So they start with you and your friends. And if you happen to have a bunch of friends who are activists, something may be born out of this network, but it's not about activism. It's about you and your network, your friends. So that's, I think, a little bit different. The reference here is, of course, Manuel Castells. He's sort of a big name sociologist, so he comes up with these cool ideas and cool brand names, almost like mass self-communication. So basically, you communicate with yourself, and you get a lot of sort of echo chambers in your little network. So the big question, I think, that we've been asking for the last 10 years, because now we have almost 10 years of research on social media, is whether these networks actually lead to expansion of our social ties, and whether they really improve access to information, or maybe we're just hearing our own voice. So what we know from research that, again, is about 5, 6, 7 years old now, is that on social media in general, and let's talk about Facebook maybe for a while, there is something called context collapse. The fact that your, let's say, brother, mother, office colleague, random people you met at a conference, that they're all in the same network. That's a little bit unusual, because it's basically mixing people from different walks of life. So there is some diversity there, and then if you post something on Facebook, all these people are going to read it. And if you look at the average number of friends you have on Facebook, it's probably a little higher than the number of friends that you actually have. So my guess would be, in this room, probably the average number would be about 300 or 400, maybe even more. Okay, so these people come from very different walks of life. When you're in a room with a lot of different people, and let's call this media ecology or room, you may hear some weird things, or some things that you would not expect in advance. Some people say, like Cass Sunstein, they say that this is one of the sort of key principles of democracy, that you have to be exposed to information that you would not have expected in advance. You have to be surprised sometimes. Also, you have to be exposed to a certain level of disagreement, because if you're always hearing just your side, and you're always hearing information that confirms your belief, this is probably not good for democracy. So, again, the premise of social media was that you're going to have a lot of people there, and you're going to be connected to them, and they're going to bring some fresh information to you. To give you a case in point that's outside politics is, of course, LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a professional network, right? You use it to expand your network. You use it to hear things that you wouldn't have heard otherwise. Maybe some new things from your profession, maybe something else, or maybe just to hear about the jobs. So we're expecting that this information flow, increase in information flow, so to speak, will lead to certain, let's say, political or civic benefits. As Carol mentioned, we think that there is a sequence of events. You get exposed to information, then you express your reaction to this information. Preferably then you engage in talk with your peers about this, and that may lead to participation. Of course, it doesn't always lead to participation, but in many cases it does. So discussion, talk, deliberation oftentimes lead to participation, especially if participation is not restricted. Okay, so if you look at some cases, yes, people talk a lot about politics, but they don't really participate much because there's not many sort of real life venues for political action. Now, here's a problem. We have not changed much as humans. So the networks have changed, technologies have changed, but we have not changed. We still need to sleep 6 to 8 hours a week. We still need to eat 2 or 3 times a day. We still need, as they say, about 2 hours a day to maintain a stable relationship with one person. So those of you who are married, it's 2 hours a day. If you cut it to 1, you're in trouble. And you know what happens when, you know, a friend gets engaged or something? They basically lose usually 1 friend. So being married probably cost you 1 close friend. Okay, not directly, and you don't know exactly which friend this was, but basically you just don't have enough time. The same goes for information here. We still have exactly the same amount of time to read information. And since you have 500 people speaking at the same time, at least that was the premise of Facebook. There was going to be a network of people and they're talking all the time. You need to do some filtering here, right? Because you actually can listen to 500 voices at the same time. You don't have the time and you're not really interested. So what do? We have intelligent agents or social algorithm that's basically artificial intelligence learning about what you like and dislike and cleaning your information environment for you. That's the first thing that basically happens. The second thing that happens is that, well, we also clean our information environment. One of the simple examples is that, you know, you see something that you dislike and you just close it. You close your window or you cover it or something, right? And the second one that's more interesting is what we call unfriending, right? And if you look at your usage now compared to your usage 5 years ago, you will see that much more communication goes on in small groups or individual communication one-to-one. So if you look at what you did today since you woke up, it's probably mostly Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp. You're not posting much on public forums unless it's related to this conference. So we are kind of back from, you know, talking to 500 people to talking to basically 5 people or 15 people. And if you look at your usage in the past, let's say, a week, my guess is that you did not talk to more than about 15 or 20 people outside work. So the work groups, let's say, don't count for this. So why is this important? The premise was that, again, social media will lead to more information, and this information will be diverse, and a lot of this exposure will be completely accidental. So just because you have some weird person who posts about, let's say, gender issues, you will hear more about gender issues, and that's probably good for you, even though you're not really interested in gender issues, for instance. Okay. Another issue is that when we address people, we usually have a specific audience in mind. So when I prepare for an academic conference, I have a different kind of talk than when I am preparing for a conference that's going to be more mixed in terms of the audience. So I know how to sort of adjust my presentation. You kind of do that on social media, but sometimes you make a mistake. Maybe you post something that's, let's say, too polarizing, or something that was maybe a joke that wasn't funny, or a racist joke. And then you will probably get feedback from the audience, some members of the audience who say, why are you posting this? This is rude, or this is offensive, or something like that. So why is this important? Because it gives us certain exposure to disagreement. And again, I think disagreement is one of these normative principles of democracy where you're expected to encounter some difference in opinions. Okay? So this was the promise, at least the promise of social media the past 10 years. However, people are people, and we have a certain preference for information that we agree with, just like we have preference for people who are very similar to us. So birds of a feather flock together, this is something that will not change. If you're a liberal, probably 90% of your friends are also liberals, right? So This is basically technology interacting with human psychology. And human psychology involved so that we are more or less a group-based society. So what happens? When we go online, we are slowly cleaning our environment, right, to make it more in line with our, let's say, social preferences or psychological preferences. How do we do this? If you think about, let's say, Facebook, I think Facebook is a pretty decent example. There are ways to, let's say, reconfigure your information environment. One is what we call selective affiliation. So that's friending. You know, if you meet a very strange person, you will probably not add this person on Facebook because it's too strange. This person is too strange. If it's a little bit strange person, that's fine. So I friended this person. This person became my friend. And if this person behaves okay, I will keep him or her as a friend for a while. Let's say for, I don't know, a couple of years. But if this person starts misbehaving, I will engage in something that we call post hoc filtering. Basically, unfriended goodbye. Okay. Now, just a quick check here. How many of you have unfriended people? Okay. Okay, good. How many of you have unfriended people for political reasons? Okay, that's about right. So about 10 or 15%. Yeah, I'll show you the data that probably shows something very similar. Now, this is slightly different. This is exposure to difference in the United States. And I'm particularly interested in this graph. This is, by the way, coming from a research done by Facebook. So these researchers were Facebook researchers using, I think, about 12 million Facebook users for data. Just to explain how this works, this graph. So on the y-axis is the percentage of cross-cutting exposure. So basically exposure to things that are outside your ideological, let's say, circle. So something that's a little bit different from your ideology. And you can see there's liberals and conservatives here. Randomly from network being Facebook network, randomly, if you choose randomly, you get about 40 to 45% likelihood of being exposed to something that's different from your opinion. So basically it's a flip of a coin. If you look at your network, so network of people who you are actually friends with, that drops so dramatically, okay, especially for liberals. So you go from 45 or 46%, you go all the way down to maybe 22 or 23%. Because liberals tend to hang out with other liberals. And other liberals are also reading liberal newspapers or blogs or whatever, right? So the drop just because of selective affiliation, because you affiliate yourself with people who you agree with. And then what you're actually exposed to, what you actually clicked on. So suddenly from about flip of a coin chance of being exposed to something different, we're getting to about 20% for liberals and about 30% for conservatives. Surprisingly, conservatives actually get exposed to more diverse stuff. Now, let's just briefly talk about the consequences. Again, normatively speaking, we're expecting that exposure to difference is good. But it's not so simple. If you're a protester or if you're a party activist, you don't want to hear the other side. You want to protest. Or if you want to get engaged in the party politics, you don't really want to hear what the other party has to say. You're basically rooting for your candidate, right? So for political participation, sometimes these narrow views are good. You know, it's sometimes better not to hear the other side. For civic engagement, for engaging with your communities, it's actually usually negative, right? So people who are exposed to more diverse perspectives tend to be also civically more engaged, right? So it looks like, depending on the nature of engagement that we have with society and with community, sometimes exposure to cross-cutting news or cross-cutting perspectives can be bad because simply it gives you a certain level of ambivalence, right? And it creates conflict. You don't really know. If you hear that your candidate is actually a liar, that's kind of unpleasant to hear and it maybe confuses you, right? So again, political disagreement is a good thing, but it depends on the context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about political unfriending in Singapore and Hong Kong. We have data from about, I think, 4 or 5 years, using even the same surveys that Carol mentioned. So this is Singapore 2013, and we're talking about hiding content on Facebook. We're also talking about unfriending. And you have civic participation here and political participation, so different categories of participation, right? So for civic participation, the percentage of people who unfriended is about the same, right? So about 9%, maybe a little bit more for people who are actually not active, right? So for civic participation, it looks like it doesn't matter. For political participation, it matters quite a bit, right? So those who are not engaged politically, they don't unfriend politically as much, so they don't hide content as much as those who participate much more. You have exactly the same pattern for unfriending, and it's about 8–9%. Basically, this is pretty stable. This is another interesting thing. We've done this research across different countries, and it looks like the number of people unfriending, the number of people unfriending for political reasons is similar in many countries. Most countries it's kind of the same. It depends, of course, on the political context. During the elections, it goes up. During the times of conflict, it goes up. But what you see here is that those who are politically more active are also more likely to basically unfriend, which means probably less likely to be exposed to disagreement. Singapore 2015. So this is, again, times of probably slightly greater polarization. There's elections and people are rooting for their candidates and whatnot. Rally attendance. So people who attended rallies, 15% of them have unfriended or followed someone, okay? People who actually bought campaign products, so people who actually gave money, contributed some money to the campaign, 32% almost unfriended or unfollowed someone. So it looks like those who are really active, they're really cleaning actively their environment with, probably from those who they disagree with. Now, it's not always about disagreement. If you look at the top reasons here for unfriending, sometimes it's about disagreement. If you look at number 2 here, it's about disagreement. But sometimes it's not disagreement. It's maybe posting too much. A person who posts 20 updates a day is likely to get unfriended, right? A person who posts stuff that's, racist, offensive, or something like that, they are also likely to get offended. Some people unfriend, not because they are offended, but because they are scared that their friends will be offended. So you're cleaning your environment so that your friends will not be offended. It's very nice of you. Okay, Hong Kong. So this is during Occupy Central. And this is data collected from students, many of whom have participated in the protests. We have 3 categories here. So we have people who did not attend, people who are low attendance, and people with high attendance. As you can see, high attendance is by far more hiding posts than didn't attend or low attendance. Low attendance, by the way, meant coming for a protest once, basically to check it out and take a couple of selfies. So that's not really participation. High attendance meant that you actually spent some nights there. Okay? So people are a little bit more hardcore. People who go there and spend nights and they sleep in a tent and whatnot, they're a little bit different. If you look at the unfriending, it's about the same. So low attendance and no attendance about the same. People who are a little bit more hardcore are also unfriending people at a much higher level. The most hardcore people, I didn't show this here, but the most hardcore people have, about 40% of them have unfriended for political reasons. So for the very hardcore, the information environment becomes much more narrow. Okay, very quickly just to look at the consequences of this. So I think for the past maybe year and a half or so, we were all like swarmed with these articles on fake news and disappointed with the status of our news media. And I think we're probably going to continue being disappointed because our expectations are maybe a little bit too high. Don't forget that we had a mass media, let's say, phase or a period for about 200 years. It's only 200 years, even less than that. Before that, who knows whether we had journalistic standards or standards of objectivity or whatnot. So I think people, when they speak about fake news, they think that these news don't have value. They have value for people who are partisans. The news that Hillary Clinton had a child with an alien is obviously fake, but it's kind of fun if you hate Hillary, and you will read it. So I think the value judgments about whether news are right or wrong or correct or incorrect, that's one aspect to look at it. The other aspect is whether people really want to read this, right? So for those who want to participate in political struggles, okay, especially if it's a little bit more hardcore, like elections or protests or something like that, they want to read this. And it's going to be a little bit hard to stop them, regardless of whether these news are correct or incorrect, or fake or not. So sometimes we need this, in a way, this is because we're humans, and we don't want to hear the other side. Social media gave us an opportunity to engage with much broader society, but what's happening now is that we are, I think, going a little bit back. So we had the opportunity to talk to 500 people on your Facebook, but you decide that you're going to talk to 15, because basically that's sort of our natural range for exchanging opinions. What should we do about this? So if we are concerned about echo chambers, and I know that this word has been used and abused, I think, quite a bit. one of the fundamental problems that people don't really talk about much is that there's a conflict between advertising efficiency, right, and, let's say, democratic ideals here. Advertising efficiency means you get the best bang for your buck. I'm able to more and more precisely target a person, right? That doesn't necessarily work well for someone who wants to have, let's say, educated or informed citizenry. Because my targeting, if it's so precise, will give only one version of the world to this person, right? So if you look at the largest advertising firms in the world, and they're basically Google and Facebook. The other firms sell advertising, but these guys actually provide the space for these advertisements, right? And they provide the eyeballs. What should we do about this? I mean, can we address this? Well, you can pressure them a little bit. You can tax them. So one thing that I had in mind here is selective taxation. If you're making money on fake news, well, okay, but you pay 50% tax, not 5, or 15, or no tax like many of them do, right? Because remember, back in the days, not so long ago, everyone who was advertising on television or cable had to be licensed, right? You had to be a licensed cable operator, or a licensed TV operator. Facebook is basically now an unlicensed cable operator because they mostly send videos nowadays across the world. They don't really have license for broadcasting, right? They don't really pay tax in most small countries, right? So that's the first, I think, solution. The second solution might be about nurturing professional curators. I think many of you who have background in journalism know what this means, which means that, you know, if you want to really maintain this public sphere, you have to train people. And you have to nurture them. You need fact checkers. You know, if you're concerned about fake news, your organization needs fact checkers. Right? And as you've noticed with all these scandals related to WikiLeaks, only organizations with large budgets with fact checkers were able actually to make a difference. Because putting a terabyte of data online doesn't really help ordinary citizens, right? Civic education is another one, you know, thinking about what it means to be engaged in politics. Whether it's just going to a rally and shouting the name of your candidate or it means something else. And with that, I want to leave you because I want to talk about this a little bit more. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. A nice, well-rounded conversation, and I always like it when it comes back to nurturing journalists, so that's good, and critical thinking. Well, now we're going to actually hear from our next panellist who has some hands-on insights into e-democracy from the Indian perspective. So please welcome Mr. Astik Sinha, who is a policy consultant working at the Office of the Chairperson of the Parliamentary IT Committee in India. He navigates various issues critical to the success of India's IT sector. Now, Astik has been directly involved in the state election campaign of 2012 and the Indian general elections of 2014 that witnessed the rise of Mr. Narendra Modi as Prime Minister. He's worked closely with the youth wing president of the ruling BJP party in India on numerous socio-political campaigns, and he was also the editor-at-large for Youth Ki Awaaz, that's India's largest youth-led platform. And Mr. Sinha is a core group member of the Sustainable Development Goals Caucus as well. So please welcome Mr. Astik Sinha to the stage.
Thank you so much. Could we have a show of hands just to understand if anybody's been to India from the audience? Oh, wow, quite a bunch of people. Lovely. So India is undergoing a transition right now, and this has been happening since 2014. When the current Prime Minister, took over and the BJP government came to power. So I was looking at the topic, and my friends have focused more on the online aspects of e-democracy. And if you, it's kind of an acronym. If you, expand it, it actually means electronic democracy, right? And what's the key essential ingredient for a democracy? Free and fair elections. So I'm going to start with that. and talk a little bit about how we conduct elections and why that's important to e-democracy and how that's changing the landscape. It has changed the landscape, in fact, in India, and how other countries are looking to adopt that. And do I just press? Okay, so the first and most essential thing about democracy is voters registering to vote. In the olden days, and in fact in a lot of countries, we still have people filling up forms, or you have the election commission going on an election drive and you register on papers and you get it submitted. In India, what we started was an e-voter registration, which you can do online. And you're able to track your application sitting in the comfort of your home. So that makes it easier for people. It's not so cumbersome to go out and find an election commission office in your district or in your state. The second thing that's critical for elections is the electoral roll. Is your name on the electoral roll? I mean, you might reach the election booth and maybe your name's not there, so you can't vote. That's something you can check online as well. The model code of conduct. When do you stop campaigning? When do you start? What are the things you can campaign about? And what are the things you can't say? Everything is online again. The election manifesto, the most critical thing when it comes to an election for political parties and candidates. Once again, and I think this is happening across the world, not just in India, it's online and it's being synchronized on various platforms, primarily Facebook, WhatsApp, and through short videos on YouTube, Vine videos, in fact. Candidate affidavits. So in India, there is, and I think a lot of you who visited would have heard this, that there are lots of elected representatives who have a criminal background. As a voter, that concerns you, right? But you don't really get to know what is the criminal background, what did he or she do. The affidavits, basically the form that you sign to contest an election, what your income is, what your assets are, all of that has been online since 2004. 2004 was a general election year. The last two, I'm going to speak for a minute or two about the voter search and polling station. This is a web portal on which you log on, and I'll just quickly, this is how it looks. So as a voter, you're sitting at the comfort of your home. You can do all of these things. You don't need to ask anybody. You don't need to even call up anybody. You don't even need the support of a party candidate or a worker to help you out. So you apply, you can register, you can delete your name, you can find out if your name's in the electoral list, you can track your application. You can find out who the chief election officer in your district is. You can find out a bit more about casting your vote, why it's important, assuming you don't know. Where your polling booth is, why the electronic voting machine, I'm just going to come to that in a minute, how it works and what are the procedures for voting once you get to the booth. And you can register your complaints. All of this sitting at home. So I think this expands on the whole notion of democracy, by giving people the power to just sit at home, do all of these things without having the hassle to go anywhere. Okay, the last one, voting EVMs. This is something which we started in 2004, the first Indian general elections in which we had electronic voting machines. This is how they look. So over here, you press the ballot that you support, the party that you support. You've got the symbols, and you've got the name and the party written there. And once, a lot of people have questioned this, saying, are electronic voting machines secure? What about fraud? What about if somebody gets hold of the chips? All of those have been baseless till now. In fact, 3 weeks before this conference, The Indian Election Commission organized a hackathon. They said, and they asked all the political parties, send one representative to our offices across India and try and hack our election voting machines. Hardly anybody turned up. But yes, they're always the first one to accuse it when they lose. All right. So this has been going on since 2004. I'll just share a little bit more in terms of trivia about it. One voting machine allows you to cast 3,840 votes. 64 candidates can vote through one machine, and it costs around $640. It might seem a little bit expensive, but it's not, considering the size of India, where you have roughly 1.3 billion people. Some of those who are concerned about sustainability, climate change, the ecosystem going green, the EVMs, they're perhaps the best way to go green, because you're saving roughly around 10,000 tons of paper and transportation fuel. So I would highly recommend, for those who are engaged in politics and in governance, to look at this as a means of voting. Some countries that have adopted this and have asked India for help are Kenya, Namibia, Nepal, Bhutan, and Fiji. But I'm a little surprised why some European countries aren't looking to, adopt this system. All right. Digital India, this is the flagship scheme of the government. This aims to connect India by digital broadband highways, public internet, public information which is accessible and free to everyone, like the e-voter registration portal I just showed you. Universal access to phones. So one of the most beautiful things that's happening in India right now is from a rural economy where we used to have landlines, and it used to take roughly a year or two to get a landline connection, India's transition to mobile connectivity. So those who don't have a landline today are directly getting mobile connectivity and data. And imagine the power of a mobile and data. I'm going to explain that a little bit more as we move along. Oops. All right. So how is India going digital? How is this helping democracy? We're planning to have roughly 250,000 village councils connected by broadband internet. As of now, the figures that I have, we have around 90,000 villages connected by high-speed broadband internet cables. Once the whole circle is complete, you would have roughly 250,000 villages. And how is this going to help people? So imagine all the universities in India with Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi connections. Imagine all the schools with Wi-Fi connections. Important public marketplaces will have public hotspots. Rural India, and that's where most of India resides, 60%, will have access to IT training, skill centers and jobs, BPOs, business processing, outsourcing, companies are being set up. So keep thinking about this, because all of this is going to multiply right at the end. All right, these are some of the schemes that are catering to different sections. So democracy has to look after various sections of society, not just the elites, not just people in urban centers or those who can speak English or those who go to the Ivy League or good colleges. So the first one, it's called Jeevan Praman, which means pensioners, they don't need to go to the government office anymore. They can sit at home, take out their unique identification number, fill it in online, and say that, yes, I am alive, and I do need my pension. So you don't need to walk up there, every year and say, I need to get my pension because I'm still alive. The national agriculture market. In India, agriculture is still, it's not well connected. The farmer is not connected to the market. So how do you bridge that gap? That's a problem, because once you go out and ask for votes, the farmers are, it's a big segment that, asks you, what have you done for us? So the current government came out with a portal. Now what does this do? You're a farmer, you've got, let's say, 100 tons of X number of potatoes. You go online, you register, you say, I've got these potatoes, this is the price I'm going to sell for, and you put it up on the marketplace. The dashboard has all the suppliers, the bidders, the buyers, and the product, along with the prices. Now, somebody sitting in the north of India can see all of that happening by a farmer in South India. You just click on a button, you access the farmer's unique code, and you get in touch. And all you have to do is transport those goods now. Digital locker. Most people, we have a tradition in India of bureaucracy and government files. It's called red tapeism. So paper after paper, you keep filling them up, and you go to a government office, and they want more papers for you to sign, and they want somebody else to sign that to say that they're legal and they're not fake. So what the government came out with was a digital locker and an e-signature. So in the digital locker, the various ministries that issue your documentations, all of it can stay online. You can keep it on the cloud, which is called Meghraj. You can sign it electronically through your e-signature. And when you need it, like for a bank opening, for example, it's called KYC, I think, Know Your Customer, the form. You just open your digital locker, you type in the password, and all the data is there. You access it with your bank, and it's done. So you're not going out of your house again, you don't make phone calls again, you don't need to make photocopies, and you don't need somebody sitting somewhere to verify the documentation. I'm going to move on quickly to two things: the Prime Minister's website and his application. Let's start with the website quickly. Oops, yeah. Okay, so this Prime Minister likes to stay digitally connected and tweet a lot with world leaders, with citizens in India, and he loves to click selfies with various world leaders. But jokes apart, it's the first time a citizen in India can share his ideas with the Prime Minister, and it goes directly to his team, and every month he comes on a radio show and he talks about those ideas especially. Every year from the Red Fort, which is the Independence Day celebration on 15th August, he picks up some of those ideas and he presents them in the form of schemes or projects. That is something you couldn't do before because the website itself was redundant and defunct. The application, you could probably download it on iOS or Android and have a look at how he's engaging with people. He's also engaging with parliamentarians, which is an important segment, not just through meetings, but also monitoring what they're doing back home in their constituencies. So if an elected representative says there's a problem of highways or electricity or employment or tourism infrastructure in my constituency, he writes to the Prime Minister on the application. And the Prime Minister's team constantly goes through those feeds. But that access is only to the elected parliamentarians and not to everybody, because then it'll just be chaos and even the team can't monitor it. All right, this is, I think the UK has got a similar website called mygov.in, which stands for My Government, basically. So you want your government to be accountable, right? You want your government to listen to you. You want to share ideas. You want to share anything and engage with them. Until 2014, we didn't have a platform to do that. Now, Indians do have that. So you can take part in discussion forums. You can take part in groups where you can do polls and surveys. Blogs, and you can directly talk to certain officials who are part of the government on government schemes that are being launched. This is perhaps the single most biggest transformative initiative of the government right now. It's called the JAM Trinity. It stands for Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, Mobility. Now what's happening is, the rural India did not have bank accounts. You had an urban India that was rapidly urbanizing and had mobile connections. And the government came out with the unique identification scheme, which is called Aadhaar. So the new project aims to connect the three of them together. So in rural India now you've got accounts being opened through a small device, a handheld device, where you have access to banking services, pensions, insurance. You can also get microfinance. It's all readily available. Connect that to Aadhaar, which is your unique identification number, where your biometric is already done, your data about your demographics is already uploaded. Combine the two on a mobile device. And then you do anything you want with that, because once you go to a bank, again, it's easy. You go to a government office for a public service, it's easy. You want to book a rail ticket, a flight ticket, it's again easy because you don't need various documentation again. And you have access to money, which is right there on your phone. I could, in fact, share some of the numbers quickly with you. Okay, so since the banking accounts were opened, rural India has invested close to 10 billion US dollars. And this is rural India, who never had access to bank accounts. All of their money has come into the system. That's democracy, because once that money comes in, you can use it for various projects, infrastructure projects across the country. All right. Now, the last and most interesting thing. So this is 60 seconds of the internet in 2017. It's got all your social platforms. It's got what we do, how we tweet, and what we say, what we shop online, what we watch, and whom we interact with. Now imagine all of this happening with this. People may have different numbers about India's internet penetration and connectivity and mobile usage. It's roughly close to 300 million people who are online, who have access to internet and who are mobile. The mobile subscription is about 1 billion people. So 1 billion people have mobiles, 300 million people are on the internet, and we have a population of 1.3 billion. So can you see the gap? 1 billion mobiles, 300 people on the internet. That means 1 billion more people are going to come onto the internet. And imagine all those services being accessible by these 1 billion more people. I'm just going to go back. Imagine 1 billion more people coming online and doing all of this, combined with the messaging of the government, the media, academics, think tanks. I mean, it's got endless possibilities. So I'm going to leave it there. And probably we could take up the other issues, in the discussion. All right, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Some wonderful insights, I think, from various countries around the region there. And India certainly looks like it's taking a very streamlined approach with IT and e-democracy and the engagement. I'd like to ask you, in relation to this morning's panel, is Narendra Modi engaging primarily for pushing forward his policies, or is he engaging in some of the other behaviour that we heard this morning about, where governments are using social media to launch personal attacks and make them look more powerful to the rest of the world? Or is he, in your experience, much more focused on the people and the policies?
You can hear me, right? Yeah, okay. So Narendra Modi is, I think if everybody's got a Twitter account, you should probably log on to Twitter and check his account. It's interesting. And also check out the things he says, perhaps, in your free time. He's one of those prime ministers who loves to engage directly with people. And there's a history to this because before 2014, the national media, the traditional media as we call it, had boycotted him. They did not see him as someone favorable to contest elections as a prime ministerial candidate. And there's a history to that as well. And that history is that in 2012, there were riots in the state where he was chief minister. So the media felt he was responsible for that. And since then, it's been a vicious campaign to boycott him and tarnish his image. So he took to Twitter and Facebook as a new medium that was coming up, new media as we call it, to directly connect to the constituency, to the voter base, to the segment across India. And he reached out to them through that. So personally, he loves technology. Coming back to your second question about policies, he's using that love for technology to push the government policies forward because he understands the power of 1.3 billion people, being connected online. And as I showed, we still have 1 billion Indians not online, and it's just 300 million Indians that are doing what they're doing right now. So if you can get all of them online, if you can provide government services, cut down on red tapeism, bureaucracy, and corruption, and deliver those services in a transparent manner, I think that's what a politician wants at the end of the day, right? They want to deliver all of this, not have their image tarnished, and have the vote bank, as one would call it, re-elect them when the time comes. So he's using this platform as a tool, even when he's not in campaign mode.
You guys can share. My next question is both to Marco and Carol. Just in reflecting on the results that you've given from Singapore and Hong Kong, I just want to ask, how much do you think the laws of the land affect some of the engagement? So you notice, also the offline behaviour as well as online behaviour of people. Now, I know firsthand in Hong Kong, there were concerns during Occupy Central that the governments were taking note and taking photos and that were keeping on record the people that turned out to protest and that were leading these events, and there have been ramifications and arrests, following that up. So I just thought, both of you, do you think this is also, these concerns are also shown in the research results that you've seen, given the different laws of the land, I suppose, in Singapore and in Hong Kong?
Thanks, Anne. I think that's a very valid question and a very good one. I think for some of us who's in this room who may be familiar with Singapore's case, we have a couple of laws that govern offline speech as well as online speech, right? And traditionally, they have been known to be the OB markers that you play golf, the outbound markers. And what are they? Essentially, laws that govern against speech that may stir up racial, religious, or ethnic tensions, speech that holds the court in contempt. So if we look way far back, some of these laws, for instance, the Sedition Act and the Defamation Law, they have been put in place during our British colonial masters' time, and we have kept them all these years. So while technology and modes of participation have changed, interestingly, paradoxically, these laws have remained constant, right? So, yes, I think a very common assumption and a very intuitive conclusion is that these laws do have an impact on, say, online discourse. But if we really study and compare the trends, say, in Singapore and elsewhere, we are not exactly unique, right? So for instance, someone we know who's doing political communication studies in the US, Lars Wilnet, he published a study based on a survey done with American citizens during the second last presidential election on what people did online and the different activities they engaged in during the period leading up to the US presidential election. And his findings are actually quite similar to what we found. Essentially, the kind of activities that saw greater participation among American citizens were those that require less effort. So following, finding out what other people are saying about the election, etc. So compare that with Singapore. Is it is it a huge difference? No, right? And if you, based on my slides, you have seen that we did the surveys with Singaporeans during different times, during election times and during non-election times. 2 other surveys were done last year, but I didn't share them in this study because of time constraint. One was done in April, where there was no so-called political activity. We did it as part of a deliberation study where we wanted to see how deliberation affected people's attitudes regarding population issues. So we designed our questions to ask people what they did online when it comes to population issues. Another survey was done post National Day rally speech that was given by Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. And again, what we found was quite similar and consistent. So again, the results, the kind of participation doesn't seem to be issue sensitive or topic sensitive. So another reason I can think of is one could be due to media literacy, right? So the government has been quite aggressive in terms of pushing out media literacy efforts in what is commonly known as, say, your high school equivalent or your elementary school equivalent. So that could have sensitized people to possible consequences or ramifications of what they say and do online. That could kind of influence the behavior. Another reason could be also the public backlash that some individuals or editors of websites face when they post articles or comments that would seem to have crossed these OB markers. And again, not all of these responses come from the state. Oftentimes the responses come from other people of the online community. So I think there are a couple of other factors, but the point is I don't think we're that different from people in other parts of the world.
Just add a few things. So, yeah, people are people around the world. They don't really act very differently, but they respond to constraints by the system. So if you compare Singapore and Hong Kong, and these are the cases that we compared, they're quite similar yet very different, because in Singapore you have certain political rights which are mostly lacking in Hong Kong. So you can at least elect your president, you can elect the parliament and whatnot, which you can do in Hong Kong. Hong Kong at the same time has a freer press and there are stronger traditional civil liberties. Is this manifested in sort of the behavior that we see? It is. You know, the links between, let's say, discussion online and political action are stronger in countries that are fully free. That's for sure. When we compare data, for instance, from China with Singapore or Taiwan or Hong Kong, you get about the same sort of link between using social media and talking about politics. We are all equally political or not. So there's actually relatively few of us who are interested in politics. But if you look at the link between talking about politics and doing something about it, of course it's going to be less strong in a country like China, because there's simply not much you can do politically. There are no elections. You can't really organize a protest whenever you want. So even if you look at Singapore, you know, the venues for public, let's say, speeches or protests are very limited. So of course the system constraints to some extent influence whatever you see in the online sphere, in the social media sphere, will become, you know, real world political action. At the same time, do not forget that once these constraints are removed, people will probably act in a rather similar way. Thank you.
I'd like to open the floor to questions from the audience. If you could just let me know your name first and Please ask, the lady here first, and then the lady on the left second. Thank you.
I'm Dorothea Rieker. I'm the foreign correspondent of the German news magazine Focus, based in India. You are collecting all these data. It's a huge amount of data collection. Can you please tell us something about the data protection in India?
Absolutely. And that's something which we in the parliamentary committee, have been stressing on. And I'll start with the data encryption policy that was announced, I think about roughly a year or so back. The draft document was ready. And what happened was there were certain clauses that were very draconian in nature. So it was put out to the public to also see, give their feedback, and like in the US we've got the FCC, in India we've got TRI. So TRI did an open house where people, we would have a meeting like this and you would come and you would exchange views on it. The internet went crazy. Young Indians saw that as draconian, and they put so much pressure on the government that the IT minister had to come out and say, we are taking back this draft policy, we will frame a new one. So that's the power of the internet, in a way. Coming back to your question, we don't have that. That's something which the committee's been trying to pressure the government to do. We also don't have a right to privacy policy. It's still somewhere in the pipeline. I think the EU came out with right to forget recently. On issues of data protection, for example, Aadhaar, which the unique ID system that India has developed, there have been concerns about protection. But let me just do a poll, for example. How many people are on WhatsApp, Facebook, and use Gmail? Could you just raise your hands? Okay. It's the same scenario in India if you ask that question. Everybody is comfortable with sharing their data with private organizations whose accountability you're not sure of, but we're very unsure of sharing that same data with our governments, So coming back to Aadhaar, the unique identification scheme, there has not been a breach. Now, just because there hasn't been a breach doesn't mean you don't strengthen your data regime. The government said it's working on it. However, there aren't enough checks and balances in place. The Supreme Court recently said that Aadhaar should go through. Innovation must flourish in India, but you must have stronger privacy laws in India. And as a committee, unlike in the US where the congressional committees have more power, in India the power is only in terms of recommendations. So we can only recommend to a certain point, and then the minister and the ministry and the government have to take the final call. I hope, in a way, that answers your question.
Hi, my name is Deepika. I handle press and information for the European Union, and I worked as a journalist for 23 years before that. My question is for you, Marco. I was quite intrigued by the slide that said egocentric social media networks. And really, isn't the mainstream an egocentric network as well? Because for me, social media is so much more. It has really been a fight back to tell your story in the ways you want to tell it. And I can say that because social media allowed me to sell my debut novel. It's allowed me to start a narrative that is centered around saris. And now when I plan programs for the EU, I plan my social media strategy alongside the mainstream strategy. So really, why do we use words such as echo chambers and egocentricity and kind of always associate them to social media? Because it is really a much bigger picture than that.
Very sort of quick response. Egocentric is a sociological term and describes the structure of the network. It doesn't really talk about content of the network. So egocentric means you're in the center of the network and all the connections are stemming from there. If you look at the egocentric model versus, let's say, broadcasting model, TV model means you have a transmitter and you're transmitting content to everyone. You're just beaming the content. Whoever picks it up, it's fine. But when you're sharing stuff on social media, the first people, for it to go viral, it has to go through your friends. You can't share it with everyone. Right? So the nature of the network, if you look at the structure of the network behind, is connected through your close friends first, and then maybe not so close friends, work colleagues, acquaintances, and what. You can't broadcast to everyone in the world. It doesn't exist. Right? So if you post something on Facebook, it could go viral, but your friends have to say, yes, like it first. Right? So it's not really about the content or even the effect. It's more about the structure of the network. If you look at other egocentric networks, family is an egocentric network, right? So you and your family members, we're not there yet. You can't pick your family members based on your preferences. You can't say, I want to have a family member who's interested in politics. You can't do that. That would be interest-based community. So if you look at discussion forums, it's about content. It's not about you. In social media, it's about the message that you sent, not just any random person. And another thing that I didn't mention is that compared to maybe the Web 1.0, now we are all more or less under real name. 20 years ago, if you remember, when the internet was starting, everything was anonymous. You could post anything you want. There was almost no consequence of it. Now when you post things, you can get fired easily. Just post something stupid on Facebook. I encourage you to. Who wants to post something really stupid on Facebook and see whether you get fired? Why? Because it's an egocentric network. It's from you. If you post something stupid on a discussion forum under, XXX name, that's fine, right? So the egocentric describes the nature of the network that's used to transmit information. No, it doesn't really refer to the content specifically. Hope this answers.
Yes, so I'm Hanu Park from South Korea. The first question goes to the Dr. Carol Soon. Like according to your presentation, the media usage across, like medias, like traditional media to like social media. Actually, the time of the media usage has increased, right, across media, like both traditional and the social media. But in conclusion, that the peoples, they have not participated in the political event offline, which means they did not become from the spectators to the gladiators, right? In this case, how come do we have to understand like the news consumption or usage does not influence on the participations? So news does not do anything to the people's behaviors. So this is something contradictory. Yeah. And second question goes to the gentleman Sina, because the voting machine, and I saw some icon like washing and cooking and etc. Right? Voting machine, and I saw some icon.
The electronic voting machine.
Yeah, electronic voting. Yeah. And then I'm wondering about those many icons like the cooking and washing and
Sorry, I didn't get you. Cooking and washing.
Washing and some icons.
Oh, okay. Those are party symbols.
Oh.
Yeah, we're a very diverse country, so we have lots of political parties.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken, 1,800 registered political parties.
Okay.
I may be wrong,
That's
but
logo
at least
parties?
1,800. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, really?
They are political emblems. Yeah.
Yes, they used like the washing and cooking and.
You run out of emblems. What can you do?
Oh, okay. Okay. That means like the literacy is very low. That's why using that kind of.
So all the party emblems have to be registered with the Election Commission of India.
Yeah.
And for example, if you want to contest and you become president, you start a party.
Yeah.
You've got to go to the Election Commission and ask them, can I use this symbol?
Yeah.
You suggest a symbol, or you take a symbol that's not being used by anybody, that's already available with them. So we have lots of unique symbols.
Yeah, okay.
A major party in India has their symbol as a bicycle.
Oh.
So yeah.
That's very interesting. Okay, thank you.
Okay, the questions, the charts that I showed on the slides, they talk about if people, we look at a yes and no for easy calculation and depiction here. So the conclusion is not that people spend more time on media, but more people use this media. The proportion of people who use the media for the information actually increased. So if you look at the offline activities, even for political rallies, attending political rallies, again, it was a capturing of yes or no. So you would see that although people did say, there are people who said that they attended political rallies, they're still in the minority. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question.
We have time for one quick question, if there's one more quick question. Yes, from the front.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Lau Junni. I'm from Singapore. I'm an independent journalist, TV producer, and media trainer. A couple of things. I just have a quick question for Ashtik about the Aadhaar facility. Does this pave the way then for voting, e-voting in India, like in Estonia? And secondly, a quick point on Marco's findings. Do your findings reflect the echo chamber effect? Because I've been reading the Reuters digital news report, and the latest findings actually are quite interesting. Contrary to the echo chamber effect that we would all sort of presume social media lends itself to, they've actually found that there's been greater exposure to news brands. And also, as I think Carol and her IPS team have found in, I think, their past studies, a lot of voters actually also co-consume media alongside social media and online media. They also do look at traditional media, and I think this has been borne out by the 2010 survey that you all did a few years ago. So in that sort of backdrop, and in light of the findings of the Reuters digital news report, what are your findings like, Marco?
Well, very briefly, so it's a bit hard to measure, the extent of echo chambers, especially if you compare it historically, right? So we don't know whether we had echo chambers 20 years ago or not. We probably did. I think what's happening now is that our social media ecologies were a little more diverse than our offline ecologies. So we got a little bit more diverse, a little bit more different information, and then we are reconfiguring. So in the times of conflict or in the times of, let's say, elections, we just say, well, this is a little bit too much, so I'm going to unfriend certain people. I'm just going to clean my ecology a little bit. So is this an echo chamber? Probably not more than it was before you had social media. I think the only thing that has changed is the advertising incentives, because the advertising incentives are now basically individual level, right? So you award me money for targeting a specific person rather than blasting your message to 1 million undifferentiated voters. And I think that may actually change the nature of the content that we consume.
Yeah, so the unique identification number, Aadhaar, that's a tough one. In a way, because right now it's being used for the delivery of public services and goods and easing out financial transactions to rural India to bring more transparency. Will it go towards voting, e-voting or electronic voting as you call it? I think it's still a couple of years away, at least a decade away, because first, and there's a huge debate in India about the trust factor and the data reliability of Aadhaar. That will come eventually, because once you connect to that service with the UID number, you can synchronize so many things, and it's happened in various countries across the world. But will citizens and will the government move towards e-voting? I don't know, but will they use that Aadhaar number when they go out to vote physically, perhaps sooner than e-voting?
Well, thank you all very much. As I promised earlier, we definitely had the insights there from our panel, from an academic, from a research study point of view, as well as the practical, what is being unravelled and what's happening on the ground, so to speak. So would you please join in showing your appreciation for Dr. Carol Soon, for Marco Skoric and Ashtik Sinha. Thank you.